Hi, this is Nick from PrimeLoops.com. Today I'm going to show you 3 of the most helpful new devices that were added to Ableton Live 8. In order of explanation, those devices are the Overdrive, the Frequency Shifter, and the Limiter. So let's take a look at those 3 devices in a little bit more detail. In order to show off these devices, I've loaded up a drum loop from our Dirty South Drum Loops pack. And what we're going to do is drag some of these new devices onto the track and see how they affect these drums. So the first thing we're going to check out is the Overdrive Unit. I'll drag one onto the track here. Now the Overdrive Unit is essentially a distortion unit. However, it has a few more tricks up its sleeve than that. In addition to adding distortion to your sound, it's also acting as a subtle compressor. So various bands of audio are going to react in different ways to this distortion process. And this is essentially what gives the Overdrive its really interesting sound. Let's go through some of these interface controls before we try it out on the drum loop here. At the top we have a familiar looking XY controller, which you'll no doubt have seen before if you've used Ableton Live. And this is applied to a filter here. This filter is a bandpass filter, that is, it allows only frequencies within the band defined here to come through and actually enter the distortion unit. Anything above or below that band is passed through as dry audio and not distorted. The X-axis on the XY controller controls frequency, and the Y-axis controls bandwidth, or Q. In this way you can dial in a very specific frequency range that will be affected by the rest of the Overdrive Unit's controls. Coming down here we have a drive control, and this very straightforwardly allows you to determine how much distortion you actually want to apply to your sound. If you bring it down to 0%, it will apply the least amount of distortion possible. However, as the Live manual points out, keeping drive on 0% still allows some distortion to be applied to the signal. Thus, if you want no distortion applied, it's best just to bypass the overdrive effect by clicking on its power button right there. Moving over to the tone control, this allows you to define how much high frequency content will be left on your sound. The higher this parameter is, the more high frequencies will be allowed to pass through. The dynamics controller down here lets you define how much dynamic range is actually preserved in your sound. This allows you simple but effective control over the compression effect that the Overdrive Unit applies. So let's try this out on the drum loop. Like many of the Ableton Live devices, this device is often best used in a subtle manner, with a lower dry-wet value so that most of the sound is dry and just a little bit of the distorted frequencies are coming through. By dialing down the drive control quite a bit and bringing dry-wet down to a sensible value, I was then able to use the handy bandpass filter up here to define an interesting brightening effect on the sound that will go a long way in defining just the sound that you want. So moving on to the next effect here, we're going to try out the frequency shifter. Broadly speaking, it has 2 modes of operation, the shift mode and the ring modulation mode. By default, it's instantiated in shift mode, where you can dial in specific frequencies that literally retune the entire sound down to whatever you define with the frequency and fine knobs. So for instance, here I have a negative 320.08 Hz frequency dialed in. So any frequencies that are coming into the effect here will then be tuned down by this much. By combining this with the dry-wet control, again, you're able to balance the unaffected and affected version of the sound. In ring shift mode, the frequency shifter acts very differently. Now, whatever frequency you have set up here on these 2 knobs will be both added and subtracted to the incoming signal. There's also a handy drive parameter here where you can add a little bit of warmth to the sound, as well as a fully featured LFO section that allows you to continuously morph the frequency setting over time. And as usual, you can change between a free rate mode and a rate that's actually tied to the project's tempo. And lastly, you have the entire range of LFO shapes that you've come to expect from Ableton Live. Let's try this out first in the regular frequency shift mode. I'll set it all the way wet so that all you hear is the detuned version of the sound. So with very little tweaking, I've taken that original loop and made it into something more like a compressed 808 kick. Now I'm going to blend it with the original loop using the dry wet control. Next I'll move over to ring shifter mode, again where the frequency that you have dialed in here is both added to and subtracted from the incoming signal. I'll set it to all the way wet again, and we'll go through the same process. So you can see that on ring shift mode, sometimes it pays to have a much lower dry wet value, because on all the way wet the ring shifting effect can be sometimes too extreme for a subtle effect that you're trying to set up with your drums. But on lower dry wet values, you still get a little bit of that ring mixing in with the original signal. Last we'll try out the LFO, which will have the predicted effect of moving the frequency around over time. And that basically sums up the frequency shifter. Generally speaking, it's a really handy little utility device that allows you to retune the incoming signal. Lastly for this video, we have the limiter effect. This is something that's been a long time coming for Ableton Live because it's such a necessary utility device. It works like any other limiter, where any audio coming into the limiter will not go above whatever you have the ceiling set at. So by default it's set to -0.3 decibels, which means the signal can never go above that amount on whatever track you have it loaded onto. The other important control here is the gain control. Since a limiter cuts off any audio that goes above the ceiling, this device is often used to cut off the extreme peaks that are happening on an uncompressed or unlimited waveform. At its extreme, it can take a dynamic and vibrant loop and turn it into a squashed mess. But when used with care, it can greatly increase the volume and dynamic punch of your track by getting rid of unnecessarily high peaks in your audio material. Taking a look at this loop, you can see that it's very dynamic, and each of the hits is well defined and clear in the mix. As I bring the gain control on the limiter up, it's going to have the effect of bringing these peaks down continually, and at its extreme, it'll just be one blocky waveform, because what it's doing is deleting the peaks and then bringing what's left of the material way up to the ceiling value of -0.3. As I was turning the limiter up, you could see that this bar was moving. This is a gain reduction bar, and essentially what it does is tell you how many decibels the limiter is trimming off of your audio. In that respect, the limiter is allowing you to trade off dynamic range in your material for sheer volume, while also standing guard on your audio track and making sure that no distorted peaks come through and clip your master output. So that's about it for these three helpful devices. Taking one last look at them, you can see that we have three very simple but very effective devices that were added in this latest update. The Overdrive acts as a very intelligent distortion unit with its own brand of compression built in, as well as a easily definable frequency range that you want to be distorted. The frequency shifter acts like either a straightforward retuner effect or a ring modulator, and in both modes you have a very helpful LFO section here that allows you to automatically morph these values over time. Last we have the important limiter device, which allows you to keep any of your audio material from clipping the master output, as well as allowing you to trade dynamic range in your audio material for a volume increase. I'll see you next time for more music production tips and tricks. Stay creative.